To be, to become, to begin, where the river leans to the sea. To learn, to let go, to love. The world turns endless, turning me. Oh.
Most conversations end just as they get interesting. That's the reason infinitive conversations exist. Instead of one interview, I sit down with one person again and again, and we go deep. We build a shared foundation first, and then we walk into territory that a single conversation could never reach. With Jim Rutt, that's now been 19 conversations, and today I'm opening 3 new threads with outstanding women. Gesine Schwa, Lara Stein, and with the woman you're about to hear, Helena Norberg-Hodge. Helena arrived in Ladakh, Little Tibet, in the 1970s before it was opened to the global economy. She learned the language, she stayed on and off for 50 years. And she watched in real time what happens to a culture when the global economic machine arrives. That became ancient futures and it became local futures, and it made her one of the clearest voices in the localization movement anywhere in the world. This first conversation does what every first conversation in this series does. It asks how Helena sees the world and why. Where the perspective came from, what it cost her, what it lets her see that others cannot. And a few things to listen for. Her claim that the blindness she describes reaches into the systems thinking community itself, including friends of hers. Her argument that food and farming are not one issue among many, but a structural lever. And the tension we keep circling. This work is intensely local and personal, and at the same time it is global. It's a global coordination problem. Both are true at once. With this, I bring you Helena Norberg-Hodge. So what I'd like us to do is to set up a first framing, a perspective. So how does Helena look at the world, right? And why do you look at the world in a certain way? And then use that as a foundation to move into different territory that different questions, like, let's say, how would we think about education from the perspective you lay out? How would you think about healthcare or nutrition or housing or all of these questions from the perspective that you lay out? But let's ground that in your perspective so we really get an understanding of it, so that we have a good foundation for the next steps. Does that work?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, for me, the idea that we're going to find a way of managing global civilization is already a framing that comes out of a blind system of global elites being allowed to frame how life should be run on this planet. And the framing I come from is quite unusual in that I come from a perspective that is global, but it's grounded in experience, embodied lived experience in several points on the global map, from the least industrialized to the most industrialized to, socialist Sweden, America. And from those several points of grounded observation, I'm coming from an absolute conviction that life affirming means that the human beings have to be closer to the life that they depend on and the life that they use in order to survive, in order not to destroy. life and themselves.
Mhm.
Does that
What
make sense?
brought you? Absolutely, 100%. It makes 100% sense. But what I'm curious about is just to take a step back to somebody who is not yet seeing this. It might be helpful to take them on a little journey, just a few minutes, to help them see what your journey was to begin to see this, so that's it becomes easier to follow.
Yeah. Well, my journey started by being born into a globalized cosmopolitan family, so that I had family in Germany, England, and Sweden, and I had lived in all three of those countries as well as in America, and then had lived in France and traveled extensively. So my perspective was already from birth very unusual in relatively deep lived experience of different cultures. But it was when I was thrown into this extremely unusual experience of being in Ladakh or Little Tibet before it had been opened up to the outside global economy and global psychological influences. So the media had not penetrated because they had been sealed off. So I end up in this part of the world that was very, very unusual, not only because they had been sealed off in the modern era for political reasons. It's a part of Tibet that belongs politically to India, and the Indians had disputed borders all around to Pakistan, to the west, and Chinese Tibet on the other side, and didn't allow outsiders to come in the modern era. And what I've come to realize is that previously they had been protected by Tibetan Buddhism, because missionaries had come out and tried to do what they did to many other cultures around the world, which was to destroy their cultural self-respect and their worldview, and essentially colonize them intellectually. And the missionaries had come, and they'd written books also about their experience, which are rather interesting because they almost universally talked about how incredibly happy these people were, the high status of women, how honest they were. So they wrote with great admiration that they were still hell-bent on turning them into Christians, but they only managed to convert some orphans because Tibetan Buddhism, interestingly, essentially affirms the indigenous worldview, which is that deep experiential awareness that we are interdependent with the trees and the soil and the water on which our life depends. We are one and a part of this web of relationship. And Tibetan Buddhism, in a more philosophical way and in a way that probably satisfies the more left brain male instinct, affirmed this. And so they didn't destroy the indigenous foundations and just built on them and I think strengthened the culture. So anyway, I had this remarkable experience of learning to speak their ancient Tibetan dialect fluently and living with them and discovering, it ended up being over 40 years, discovering both the if you like, secrets to what indigenous life was all about and why it provided such a secure grounding which prevented the fear-based ego development, the need to prove yourself. There were, particularly, the fact that every mother had at least 5 to 10 caretakers for every baby. So every baby was on somebody's body all the time, provided a grounding and a security that, for me, means that we Westerners universally are traumatized and have been traumatized now for many generations. And then, on and on about that. What the education looked like, what the formation of the individual identity looked like, which allowed for genuine individualism, because you were seen and heard and appreciated exactly the way you were, and you were not made to conform to an ideal of who you should be.
So my question here is, did the backdrop is you are from a cosmopolitan background, you were brought up in the West, in the North. It sounds quite privileged, and then you had this experience. Can you pinpoint a moment that really where this understanding of the interdependence and the connectedness of everything into a web of life really became a way to look at the world for you, a new principle, or did you always have that? Did you never lose this?
I remember as a teenager being very impressed by Alan Watts and his book, Psychotherapy East and West. But that was as a teenager, and I didn't follow up with any great interest in Buddhism. Later on, when I went to study in Germany, I became very impressed with the German worldview as much more holistic than what I experienced in the Anglo world or in Scandinavia. That there was a broader, more holistic perspective, and I fell in love with early Goethe, and I read Hesse's Siddhartha, and loved that deeper and broader perspective. So I became a bit of an ambassador for Germany. Are you German, or where are you from?
Yeah, part of me is German, and I like what I'm hearing in a way, but I think also that what you're pointing towards, which is the Jena set, which is, let's say, 200 years ago, is kind of lost in today's Germany, I think.
I from what I understand, I'm heartbroken about what's happened, particularly since COVID. But essentially, Germany, I believe, first of all, had the earlier rejection of industrialism and urbanization, so they were early romantics. And they were also the sort of first Green Party. And I think partly they were not as colonized as America itself by the corporate world. So after the Second World War, more holistic medicine, even to this day, still lives on in Germany in a way that it doesn't. I mean, it's even illegal in the Anglo world because of the corporate control to heat bodies up to high temperature, for instance, which is a very wise and excellent way of dealing with serious illness, including cancer. And in Germany, that's allowed, but not in the Anglo world. And so, but the sort of neo-colonialism of the global empire from the 80s onward has been able to, through the media and through science, to enter virtually every mind on the planet. It has been more and more and more colonized. And so yes, I know that in Germany today it's not, and I don't mean to romanticize it. I feel, I lived there long enough. I think I know, shortcomings as well. And also, for me, what's quite sad is that the German language is really not very attractive, and the German accent in other languages is not attractive. And that even applies to speaking Tibetan with a German accent compared to with a French accent. So I think there's almost something universal about the sound of French. It's probably not universal, though, because, again, when I look at Ladakhi or Tibetan musicologists who came out and looked at the tones and the music, were astounded. It's just so different from anything they had known. So it may not be universal, but to my ear anyway, colleagues who learn Tibetan or some Ladakhi speaking with a French accent can sound very charming, but not a German accent. So that has worked against German.
Okay, so but what it tells me is that you had Alan Watts and the German romantics kind of like inoculate you a little bit against the left brain energy that is dominating or started to dominate in that time even more than before, and then that's found fertile ground when you were in Ladakh, and you could it started blossoming. Is that what I'm hearing?
Exactly. Blossoming and grounding and confirming and I was introspective. I was interested in psychology. I was interested in art and art history and so on as well. But I had also speculated about why it was there was so much more violence in America than in Europe, particularly than in my native country of Sweden. So, and actually come to similar conclusions about the uprootedness and the lack of deep connection, interpersonal as well as connection to the living world. And then, yes, Ladakh deepened, confirmed, and really set me in a way that now no amount of theory or intellectual argumentation can take me away from these observations that once I had a sort of map laid out for me in Ladakh and then went back to Sweden. It was so clear, why we had such an epidemic of depression, alcoholism, and suicide, in a country that was considered one of the most, held up as a great model of industrial modernity.
I I compare this kind of deep embodied insight that I think you've experienced there to learning how to read. So until you know how to charge lines with meaning, the fact that some people are pointing at those lines in the world and get excited about them or use them in any way seems rather ridiculous, right? To a child's mind who doesn't know how to read, this reading thing is kind of weird. And then there's a moment where that shifts and where you begin to understand how to charge lines with meanings. The way I usually do this is I write the word love and ask people, what do you see? And they never tell me I see a bunch of lines. They tell me everything they associate with the word love. And there's a similar insight that it appears you've had, but on a different plane. I call it increase in world literacy, where you suddenly see the world in an entirely different light, and you cannot unsee that. But at the same time, to many people who don't see, haven't had that experience, don't have that perspective change, they literally cannot see what you see, and it feels weird to them. How do you explain it, that change in perspective, to somebody who has not yet experienced that change in perspective?
Well, my experience includes questioning the importance of literacy and upholding those voices that stress the difference between the written word and oral communication. And the the oral communication, I can't even begin to tell you how amazing I find it that when I first arrived in Ladakh, essentially the news was carried orally, and it was slowly and over huge areas, high mountain passes, walking, say 3-week journey walking or on horseback. And yet the news traveled. So we had a much better idea what was going on in the region. The region is about the size of Austria.
Mm-hmm.
Now, particularly this time, I was back for my 50th anniversary in Ladakh. And even earlier, a decade earlier, it had started happening. But now people are all in different directions and connected to different realities, different events, much, much more stuff coming, but no common language and no real sharing of both of risks and opportunities. And, essentially what's happened through modernity, including through an overemphasis on the written word, but much worse. Interestingly, and that's something that we could talk about forever, would be what's the difference between this oral communication and the face-to-face oral communication. And it's night and day. And yet I think, for me anyway, I ended up being someone who could only learn things if I wrote them down. That's how I had been brought up. But also, interestingly, as I observed things in Ladakh, I became very interested in what at that time was being written about in more places than today, which was that children who grew up to learn to read much later did better, and that forcing children to read early was a big mistake. And Steiner had been part of that thinking. So in the Steiner or the schools, there had been less, emphasis, or in fact, an emphasis on not starting too early. And I was then quite pleased that I went to school in Sweden, and my birthday is right at the beginning of January. So I was almost 8 years old, because you had to be 7 years old when I was young to go to school. So I was almost 8 before I learned to read, because no one was pushing me before that. And by the time I was 10 or 11, I was reading a book a day and, loved and enjoyed that. But it was very interesting after Ladakh to also read about how very often so-called geniuses had it sort of a similar story of not learning to read until very, very late. And so the importance of developing the right side of the brain. Now, Ian McGilchrist, I don't know if you know,
I know
do you
him.
know Ian
Yeah.
McGilchrist? So
Yeah.
he's a friend, and I've had conversations with him about some of this, but I'm not sure exactly now what he would say about it. But for sure, where I'm sitting, the early overdevelopment of the left brain is, this is part of what he's looking at is how modernity, but I can't remember now, but he actually talks about that in terms of reading. And so I then also, I've arrived at the point where I believe that the original perception, the original recognition of a particular phenomena or object or whatever is, that subjectivity and that uniqueness of that experience is so fundamental, that I love also that when in ancient Tibetan, when you're speaking to someone, you are you're showing through affixes in the verbs and so on, whether you know that that person is observing what you're observing as you speak, or whether they have to believe you, that you observed it. And what's there is this infinite humility for not claiming to know things that you've never seen, that you've never experienced. And that's built into the language. And so, so the idea that we're going to have, way of managing global civilization is the ultimate in a hubris and arrogance, which leads people at the grassroots to think of everyone in power now as a psychopath, as evil, totally selfish, which I don't believe at all. I just believe there's a different, we've been educated into and living in different worlds. And the people at the grassroots are experiencing the cost of this global techno-economic empire. But I'm going off on tangents.
No.
I'm very
The,
happy. I'm
let's
happy if you prevent me from doing that. That's fine.
let's use this, because the neoliberal story of essentially two things, which is there's a market that will always move towards the best solution, and we will always find a way to innovate ourselves into whatever we want to. That's the core two elements of it. Is about 80 years old, and it's been pushed, as you say, into all of the narratives in the various dimensions of how we do civilization, how we do society, right? How we do science, and how we do governance, and how we do economics, really. And so from the perspective of this, which is very, very left brain, and which is very dependent on increased speeds because of the enormous pressure induced by the exponential growth curves of all of the central elements of the system, and the scarcity modality that creates for everybody. So there's speed, there's reductionism, there's trust in innovation, and all of that. And for somebody looking at the world through this lens, will have a really, really hard time to see the world through your lens. How, if at all, have you had experiences or successful experiences with helping a person who's stuck in neoliberal, left brain, fast innovation market, all of that, into seeing interdependence and web of life? What could be a good bridge in your perspective?
Well, for sure, I've seen that people who were able to come on some of our projects, because we carried out projects that were learning experiences both ways, called reality tours. So we sponsored community leaders from the least industrialized countries like Ladakh and Bhutan, and some from India, to come to the West, to actually experience for themselves what was going on, and to talk to people there who were trying to get out of what was very clearly a dead-end path. So, and then we had Westerners who would come and live and work on a farm with a family. And we found that over the years, almost all the Westerners who came to Ladakh in the early, well, even now actually, are often inspired, and it can be one of the best ways of opening their eyes to really trying to think more deeply and look at the world. It helps them to look at the world through a different lens, and far less so today than in the early years. Far less. But even today, people are very inspired by people who are still clearly more connected, more at peace, have some inner peace and joy that's quite different from the average Westerner. But I found also interestingly, we had a big conference or gathering in Ladakh this past about a year ago, and there were so many people from Asia, everything from Taiwan, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, Bhutan, Sikkim, and it suddenly struck me, how much more, um, how much more they still maintained a bit of that deeper, more holistic worldview and a more feminine approach, so that the men also maintain more of their feminine qualities.
Mhm.
And that's part of what we're losing and what we need to regain.
Mhm.
Um,
Would you agree that there's something in us? I usually say it in the following way, that 300,000 years of being human is stronger in us than 300 years of destruction. Um, and that it is usually quite easy for a person to step into that knowledge of the 300,000 years. So the way you're describing it, an embodied experience, being with people who are actually living like that.
I love that phrase. I haven't heard that. I think that's excellent. 300,000 years of being human and 300 years of destruction. Excellent. I haven't heard that before. And I'm glad you said 300 years, because earlier you were talking about 80 years.
Mm,
And I think it's very helpful to look at the history to see that really from the outset. And that's where I'm hoping to be able to also persuade Daniel Schmachtenberger to look more at that, the very clear problem of having global traders and global trading elites benefit from the creation of that superstructure, which has actually, from the outset, been a destruction of what it is to be human. It's meant, enclosures and slavery. So driving us
mhm,
away from our innate, inborn need for the deeper connected web of human relationships and that
mhm,
intergenerational web, deep, deep connection, so that when, what I experience in Ladakh is when you live like that, you are experiencing 7 generations. That's why
mhm,
most indigenous people talk about that. You
mhm, mhm,
experience your great grandparents and your great grandchildren, and you're in the middle,
mhm,
and that's 7 generations.
mhm,
And so it's no wonder that they would be concerned for 7 generations, and it makes them maybe less angelic and less sort of self-sacrificing than we might think, because that also, it turns out, in my experience, when we live in that human way, there is actually no need for altruism, and there
mm,
wasn't altruism, which also is why it's a bit of a disaster when modernity comes in and imposes this individual fear and, sort of fight or flight, sort of pretty extreme greed emerges, um, and the mix
mhm.
of traditional practices and modernity. That's another whole story we could talk about, how it leads to a type of corruption, which often comes out of a sense of more extended connection to family and so on, which is quite commendable in a way, but it doesn't mix well at all with modernity.
And if if we tell the story that you just told, right? So to somebody who's trapped in the mindset of the neo-colonial, liberal modality, then they will say, yeah, I see that there's some good and nice things about what you're describing, but I still want to have the luxury I have, right? The things that I can buy with the money that the global supply systems provides me with. Um, and to me, that seems like one of um, the hardest assumptions really to break, because it is always the first that comes up, and I'm always struggling to un understand how to help people see it differently. What's your take on this?
Well, first of all, I don't think that the biggest problem is that people generally are wanting more and more. I think the problem is much more so, and I think this is true at every level, so um, we are trapped in a system
Mm,
where the price of labor has been made artificially too expensive and the price of energy and resources artificially cheap. We are
mm,
trapped in a fake casino economy that pushes us all to run faster and faster just to
mhm,
stay in place.
mhm,
And that turns out, even yesterday, there was a business owner here, and very much coming from a very charitable point of view. They have a company. Well, maybe I won't name them, but anyway. But
mm,
they found that in order to increase the salaries, which they needed to do for the people who were working for them, they needed to grow because there wasn't any other way of being able to increase the salaries. So
mm,
I think it's far, far more. The trap we're in now has far, far more to do with the lack of understanding of the economic system that we're trapped in and imprisoned in. And
mm,
that's why I also feel hopeful. I really hope we can collaborate. I think, I want to get these conversations out.
mhm,
And of course, I can be accused of sounding really arrogant, that I know exactly what the problem is and exactly what we should do. No, I don't. But I
mhm,
do know some very basic, common sense, obvious ways that we could,
mhm,
from today till tomorrow, if there were the awareness and therefore the political will. And I think if the awareness were there, the political will would be there to
mm.
immediately put a moratorium on further escalation in this direction and to start switching all the subsidies and incentives that our governments are now giving to this suicidal path.
Well, Dana Meadows didn't accidentally put the ability to transcend paradigms as the most powerful lever for changing a system, right? So that is essentially what you're saying.
I am, but
One.
I need to tell you that
Mhm,
the blindness I'm talking about includes Dana. She was a friend. She and Dennis were friends. I was at MIT,
mhm,
and the group, the systems dynamics group they belonged to, for me was my tribe. I just was thrilled to meet these people who were
mhm,
thinking more holistically and deeply. And then what happened? And this is in the 70s. And then by the
mhm,
late 80s, all of these friends, including the Meadows, including Dana, are blindly ignoring what's happening in the name of free trade and globalization, and simply not looking at it. I do believe it is primarily because when you're based in one place, one point on the map, and the
mhm,
media and the funding for science are beginning to steer you, you're not seeing it. And I just
mhm,
happened to every year be gone half the year. I didn't hear any of the new ideas about how now we were going to save the world, by buying an electric car, when the same people, a decade earlier had been so clear about the continued centralization of power. They've been objecting to nuclear power for that reason. Now suddenly thinking was shifting, and it was shifting because of what was happening in the media, and it was the increasing centralized control of global
mhm,
businesses and corporations. And I knew some of those leaders. I think I might have told you. But to come back to Dana, literally, she wrote in her newsletter, and I feel bad because so many people who are now getting interested in systems analysis are quoting her, and
mhm,
those quotes are fine, but I think we need to understand why she writes in her newsletter that she's so thrilled about these wonderful people in St. Louis who have now decided to change a way from producing toxic chemicals to feeding the world sustainably. And that was Monsanto. And then I'm with her at a conference in Washington, D.C., which was all about changing the American dream. It was now all focused on targeting the consumer. You consumers, you've got to change, but not a word about what the corporations were up to. And so there she was, and she'd brought a lovely nature-loving woman from Monsanto to the conference. And when I tried to talk to her about the trade treaties and try to explain, the world does not need a US corporation to feed itself. You know, when I tried to explain more than that about the trade treaties that right then were being negotiated and what it meant in terms of these global corporations, she didn't understand. And Dennis, her husband, they separated, but who was also a very close friend, I haven't actually been in touch with, but I know he's gone in a direction where he simply does not look structurally at this. And why not? And I really believe it's a lack of global experience. And so what I'm seeing is that most of the people who have a lot of global experience have been ambassadors for the continued globalization, corporatization, centralization, technologization. And so I saw that with friends who were diplomats in India in the 70s. Again, most of them were friends of mine. And by the 90s, I couldn't bear to even talk to them. They were sitting there singing the praises of India adopting genetic engineering. While I was working with Vandana Shiva and other people trying to get, some voice for the farmers who were so clear about what it meant.
So this is, I think, a very powerful insight, which is that it is necessary on an embodied level to remove yourself from the world entirely, right? It's a different thing to go on a 1 week trip to Tibet than to actually live with the people, which is and learn the language and all of these things.
Yeah.
So this deep felt sense of a different kind of perspective of the world and the experience of that life from that perspective. That's what I hear you pointing at. Is that right?
Yes, but the scary thing is that as colonialism and later development inflicted more and more damage and created more and more greed, it also created more fundamentalism. I've witnessed it also. So in the Islamic world, especially, threatened men suppressing their women more, and not just in Islam. So now to go and live in a village will often have the opposite effect, because now it might still look quite quaint and nice and people might still be farming a bit, but when you live there, you're finding all kinds of oppression and abuse that again, I can speak of specific families and places and people I know, those things were not there. And for anyone who lives in the area, they would have to acknowledge, and there are just facts. For instance, in Ladakh, there had never been violent conflict between Buddhists and Muslims until a decade and a half of modernity pitting them against each other. Same in Bhutan. These are just facts, but they're not being discussed. They're not being acknowledged properly. And by the way, related to that is partly that I have now, literally as of only very recently, I have a fair amount of regret that I didn't listen to some of my more mainstream colleagues who were saying, Helena, stop trying to fight the inevitable, enclosure of Ladakh. Just do more research. and, record what's there. And I was so offended by that. And I was continuing to do everything I could to try to mitigate and minimize the destruction, trying to build this movement and so on. But now when I think of it and I realize that there were all of these students coming up to study the impact of smoke and, both dung and wood smoke on people's health, and, recommending new stoves or, even microwaves as a better way of dealing with it. And I realized there was not a single study that looked at the impact of bringing in diesel and fossil fuels of every kind, hard coke, coal, kerosene stove, not a single study. And I managed to bring out a doctor to do a bit of research to see if he could find traces of cancer. And, he didn't, but it's just not enough of a study to be worth anything. But, the amount of research, even today, that we could have that would so clearly prove the disastrous effects of the entire package of chemicals and plastic and all the effects of fossil fuels. And right now, anyway, I was going to just say a friend of mine,
Go ahead.
no,
Go
a
ahead,
friend of
please.
mine started doing a film about how it's affecting the sperm count. And we did have from Scandinavia already in the 70s and 80s, we had quite a lot of evidence about the impact of pesticides and so on sperm. But now it's become absolutely disastrous. And yet there's almost no discussion of it because the corporate empire wants us to maintain a carbon-centric view of what's happening, which is completely fraudulent.
So going back to that point, which is that stepping out of what I call the Molochian shit show, the global neoliberal paradigm of extraction and neo-colonial behavior, and really experiencing a different kind of perspective. You went to the other side of the planet, almost literally. Do you think it is necessary, or do you think these kinds of embodied experiences that help you step out of the perspective of the Molochian shit show are also available to a person in the West in a much
Yes, and I
more
would
immediate
say,
way?
yeah, and I would say, also I do want to stress that in my, by chance, the way things developed, I ended up, every year in America, and even noting the differences between life on the West Coast, where I quite thrived. Berkeley in the 70s was a sort of paradise for me. The combination of left-leaning politics, interest in Buddhism, holistic thinking, and ecology. It was a wonderful place, and I had wonderful colleagues and friends. But then I saw the change. But even, every year being in New York City and often in Boulder, Colorado, and also in Germany and in Sweden and in England. So, and then later on, every year in Korea and Japan, and interacting with people in, South America. So having ongoing relationships and voices, literally from every continent, is what's informed, my thinking. And but I wanted to, what was it you just said now? Yeah, I want to say that I think that the thing that could make such a big difference right now, and it's the central and most important issue and strategic area to focus on, is food. And I would argue that anyone who could live and work for a while, now I don't know how long, but in one of the new local food economy worlds, be it in Liège, in Belgium, be it in, in England, in Germany, in Brazil, in Ladakh, anyone who could have that experience could be helped to shift their thinking in what is the building stone and the most important area to focus on, which is food and farming. And so remember, with the enclosures and with slavery, people were driven away from diversified production for the regional needs, regional, local, even national needs, to produce monoculture for distant markets. And that structurally is the most important thing we need to change to come back to life-affirming economic practices. How we extract from the living world to meet our needs, shift away from monoculture for distant markets to diversification for markets closer to the area. And that includes, fishery. Right now we're buying, carefully line-caught fish that has been caught by a fishing line, not by a trawling net that can hold 17 jumbo jets. And, we know architects who are harvesting oak trees that are about to be cut down to be turned into chips. It's unbelievable what's happening. And on the farm, bigger and bigger, more and more chemicals, more and more technology, and replacing people with robots and drones and so on. And it's a disaster.
That's that points into another direction, which makes it usually hard for people to really see how they can step out of this and therefore change perspective, which is it's utterly overwhelming, right? How are you as a single individual going to do anything about this? And then
exactly.
we conclude we need to coordinate, but the machinery for coordination has been hijacked by the very same machinery that has hijacked agriculture and education and the health system and all of the others.
Exactly.
So what can the first mini step for a person in a city in the West, Northwest, around the Atlantic, what could the first mini step be for that person to start on that journey as they are being trapped in their life?
There's sort of two levels to that. I mean, practically speaking, the first step would be to support local food initiatives. And it means, the first step, again, if they are listening to what I'm saying, they will be listening to my arguments as to why that's so important. But that would be the most, practical, most important thing they could do to start shifting things in a meaningful way. But we also, in talking to sort of the average person, particularly in the West, but not only, we like to emphasize, 5 words. And the first one is reconnect. The second one is rethink. The third one is resist and renew and rejoice as a final. So we're saying the reconnection, what we recommend is that you reach out to find at least another person, ideally 2, 3, up to maybe 20, that you could meet with regularly to practice deeper reconnection. Now, these things are happening. They're emerging. There is a cultural turning. People are hungry for connection. So there are all these circles of reconnection emerging. Men's groups, women's groups, mother, daughter, father, son group, and more also connecting the human reconnection with reconnection to nature. So these things are happening, but we would like to see them as stepping stones to then move on to also start doing something meaningful and practical to change, the disastrous situation and we're also saying when you move on to that, you'll feel even better. But, in one thing too that's different in our work from many is that it was so clear to me that the human connection is the most fundamental by far. Even little monkeys will die if they're not
Mhm.
held. And so the fabric of social connection is the most fundamental to regain a sense of what it is to be human, and a sense of joy and meaning. And so that's why in these groups, we really urge people to be willing to look at these models of a deeper dialogue from the heart, being able to share, in a vulnerable way, and prove that we can be loved and connected with all our
Mhm.
imperfections, all our fears, all our eating disorders, et cetera, et cetera. But combining that also with a nature, awakening nature, spiritual connection is the human connection is spiritual as well. And I also
Mhm.
recommend chanting and singing, which is again
Mhm.
something that almost all indigenous people did. And the chanting and singing is a wonderful experience of that sense of oneness and connection. And then, in nature, perhaps, encouraging children, to feel like they're part of the cloud in the sky or in the tree, to encourage a more contemplative and relaxed way of connecting to nature. And
Mhm.
then, if you do it as a group, you can do it so much more easily. You don't have to pay thousands of dollars for some fancy vision quest with some fancy leader. You can do it as a group, and
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
means one person can find the place, the other person can help buy the food, and you can have so many practical benefits by being part of a group. But the journey for us then, very importantly, should include quite early on a willingness to rethink. So we're offering a journey which is looking at this messy world we're in, the sense of overwhelm we have, the fear we have, and we're saying we can offer a, a view, a worldview that will help you both feel better and do something more meaningful to heal not only yourself but the world. And so to take that journey, you have to rethink so many assumptions that you've been spoon-fed really since
Mhm.
the beginnings of modernity, beginnings of enclosures, urbanization, being driven into these cities that in and of themselves drove us into fear and competition, and then
Mhm.
structurally have been a disaster. And so, yeah, so then that leads on to being willing to articulate a rejection of a continued
Mhm.
um, development in that direction, leading to what we find is that too many people, when they discover nature's spirituality and the joy of it, or the reconnection, and they discover how, much better they feel in that journey of reconnection, they just go with that and they refuse, and are often, I guess they're often either afraid of or believe there's no point looking at the bigger system. There's the
Mhm.
assumption we know it all, no need to look at it, no need to do anything about it, either because it's hopeless, we can't change things. So we're sort of part of our journey is no, we're insisting that if you do look at the dominant system, you'll be able to mobilize more people to do more great things at the local level. And you might even be able to, and we can show where it happens, change policy at the local level. But we want you to also join a global perspective to build up a global movement
Mhm.
to pressure our individual governments to take the steps to rein in the corporation. And, we see, it's a simple message. Are we going to be allowing corporations to sue our governments if they threaten their profit, which is what they're doing? You know about the
Yeah. No.
ISDS clauses, right? That fact really needs to get out there. And or are we going to say, no, we are only going to elect people who do what we're asking. We're voting for them. We're not going to allow this complete darkness and not even lies, ignorance about what's actually going on in politics. We've
Mhm.
got to spell out the truth about a global empire ordering our governments, taking them to court if they dare to inhibit their profit-making activities. So that we're going to then insist that the way forward is not global government. The way forward is that government should stay as close as it is to people right now and eventually start possibly devolving, but not now. We're not trying to argue for a breakup of the nation state right now. We want the nation state to become the place at which global corporations come back to place-based or localized. So Mitsubishi goes to Japan, Volkswagen to Germany, so that, and then through, again, an international movement, clarity about how they are now going to be regulated and they're going to be taxed. And
So
they can
essentially,
collaborate. They can collaborate. A lot of people believe that we would never have a single technology if we didn't allow these global corporations freedom. They think we wouldn't have had the telephone or anything.
so you built a beautiful arc from a small local intervention, some people
Yeah.
getting together to do something for themselves, and then all the way to putting pressure onto national and international forms of governance. And just before I tell that story, I just want to dispel what you just said, the ISDS thing, right? Which allows investors to sue governments or countries for loss of profit. This is you're completely right. This is not well known, and this is a crucial element in the
and it's
globalist
actually
landscape.
it's not suing them for loss of profit. It's suing them for a potential loss of profit. So and it's let's also not say investors, let's say global corporations and banks. So because we have to have clarity about these actual entities and structures and see that those structures need to be changed. And so they are governments are signing agreements in clauses that are called investor state dispute settlements or ISDS clauses, where they say you can sue us if we do anything that threatens your profit making. So when Germany decided to phase out nuclear power, the Swedish nuclear power company sued them for billions of dollars because they were planning to make money out of Germany. And this has happened also with toxic chemicals. It's happened. So it's ongoing. And I hope people will look at our campaign in Sweden, which is called The Real Economy. And we're trying there to really get in that small country where there is still a closer relationship between the voter and government, some honest discussion of it. And we're making headway. We're working with a famous actor, and we're hoping that we'll see. I've seen countless things shut down the minute they talk about this. Very clear, very structural, not vaguely capitalism, which I don't even like to use the word. And by the way, I don't use neoliberal either. These are abstractions. And really, if we're going to say, what are we going to call it? Because it started, with enclosures and slavery.
I usually use Molochian shit show. Because that is the most precise descriptor for me.
But I didn't hear the first word. What do you call it?
Molochian shit show. So the shit show of Moloch, the god we feed our children to.
Okay.
So, but I mean, just to back up on the ISDS thing, the way I really admire the Costa Rican people, because my wife is from Costa Rica. We spend a lot of time there, and what the people always consistently do is they stand up against the decisions of the government, which sometimes is costly, because if you if the government, which is it's happened 4 times already this year at least, where the government is trying to give up some mining rights to some global corporation, and then the people stand up and say no. Sometimes it's already too late in the game, so that that company then pulls the ISDS card. So right now, Costa Rica is paying a Canadian company for a potential loss of profits for not letting them mine. Just as one also very, very concrete example of a country that really cannot allow itself to pay billions of dollars to
Yeah.
foreign corporations for nothing, but they still do because the people have coordinated, and I think that's a really, really, really crucial point, the coordination part. But
Yeah. Yeah.
stepping back into the small and into the
Can you
food
send
systems.
me something about the Costa
Yeah,
Rican situation? Do you have?
I
Could
will do.
you?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
will.
Okay.
Um, so I once asked Tyson Juncker-Porter, who you probably know,
You
asked,
very well.
asked Tyson, so how does a weird person like myself learn how to live with the land, right? And so he said, follow the water, or
Sorry.
follow the water.
Oh.
And so what he meant was that by following the water in my region where I live, I will, over the course of a year or two, start unpacking what the ecosystem actually is and does. And by doing that, I will also become part of the ecosystem. So his symbol for me having done that work was that the water would accept me because it would smell like the ecosystem. Now, he claims that he could translate this into a city, but my way of translating this into a city about I don't know 10 years ago or so was that with my first child we decided we're not going to use any single-use plastic anymore. So if you do that, then several things get out of reach. For example, for a 6-year-old who loves gnocchi, suddenly you cannot go to the shop to buy gnocchi. You have to go to the market and hope somebody sells unpacked gnocchi, or you just make them yourself. And then it turns out you make them yourself. It's a really rewarding exercise. You have an enormously delicious meal afterwards. And if you consistently do that across all the spectrum of things you would usually buy in a packaged way, and you start making them yourself, you see that it's easy, it's cheap, it's rewarding, and it's actually feeding you better. And that can be done on a very, 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 very small scale. So this, to me, is an example of what you just said, which is ask the right question, because that can open the crack into the system, just like a little plant in the pavement opens a crack, right? And then
Yeah.
something bigger grows and it opens up this horrible seal.
Yeah. I am maybe overly worried about asking too much of people, but I guess, I ended up literally again from 77, I guess, when I went back to Sweden, and now with a sort of this knowledge that we can live so much happier lives and so much more fulfilled and joyous and vibrant. And then, I go back to Sweden and it feels so dead, and to see then, the degree of depression, loneliness, alcoholism, suicide, my heart, has just ached for people who so blindly and so unnecessarily have continued to go down in a direction where now the overwhelm, this, number one cause of deaths among adolescents is suicide. And so, and I'm now seeing these incredible time pressures that everybody's so busy, and, including myself. And I'm seeing, I don't blame myself. And I'm not either as an individual trying to do the right thing. And so I worry about too many suggestions saying, well, as an individual, take more time to do the right thing. because I'm seeing the time poverty and also the financial poverty growing, so it becomes quite a privilege. And so I'm saying, if you can just carve out a little bit of time to send these films further, to send these messages further, please do that, as a minimum. And if you can't afford to even buy at the local food thing, which I would say following the water is good, but I would say I worry a little bit now about money wanting to fund bioregionalism instead of local. And bioregionalism is very much about this, let's rethink completely how we're structured, our borders. It's going too far too rapidly. And the reality is that when you open your eyes, people who are squeezed financially and time-wise and manipulated by algorithms that polarize and create dissension. The dissension that's being created is among a lot of very stressed, marginalized people, is anti-green, anti-immigrant, anti-gay people, anything under the sun, but not anti the corporation. And so we've got, and again, I'm not about anti anything. I'm about trying to be, constructive and positive and not demonizing people, but being very clear about ideas and practices that are simply, I would say, even evil. But I'm not going to stand as a god and condemn people as evil, but I will say, these activities are simply not acceptable, and we've got to change them. So I think I'm glad that there is a whole movement still of relatively privileged people who keep alive people who might be making the gnocchi in the market, or when people who have the time to make their own. And we want to, it's very much part of the whole sort of localization movement, and it's good that that's happening, but we're trying to move things further, I would say, to build something that could shift things more meaningfully.
That's what's needed, no doubt, right? But
Yeah.
the conundrum, or the what perplexes me every time I think about this, is that it's at the same time a very local, personal thing and a large coordination issue at the same time. And to balance those two, and to dance with those two ends of a spectrum, right? Trying to make it a big coordinated effort, but staying true to the personal experience, and the truth in the groundedness at the same time, is really, really hard for one person, but I think it's structurally and systemically even harder to maintain and do.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think, but you see, on the other hand, anywhere I go in the world, if I were to say, and I'm talking about, now from Ladakh and Bhutan to Korea to Germany or here, if you say governments are subsidizing and supporting global corporations, and they're freeing them of any rules and regulations, we want to change that, because they're actually squeezing everybody else, you and me and every small business, every charity, squeezing them with regulations and more taxation. We want to change that. We want to support the local businesses, and everyone agrees with that. Everyone knows that they have too much power, and yet in the small minority that takes on looking at the global economic system, it's this more abstract discussion of capitalism, not even mentioning this very real and structural reality going on right now, where our governments are handing over more and more power to them and literally being sued if they don't. these are clear, concrete, ways that we could win people over. What we have to be aware of is that the media and every source of knowledge is colonized by big money, and they're very, very clever at steering people away into little looking at symptoms, but also demonizing localization as right wing. I just had an exchange. You didn't see on Instagram. You can maybe see George Monbiot drawing do you know who he is, George Monbiot?
Yeah, I know.
So he recently had a long conversation with someone named Mark Linus, and I've known both of them for I've known George since the 70s, but he's always been very skeptical of localization. We had a debate in the Ecologist magazine in the 80s, or maybe 90s it was. But anyway, now he's basically drawing a link between fascism and those people who long for more localized economies and land-based living. And so I responded to that. And but I'm not at all surprised, because we had the problem when we set up the Forum on Globalization back in the early 90s. The biggest critics, in other words, defenders of globalization, were left intellectuals, because they've been, in a very good way, committed to international collaboration and solidarity, and they were not distinguishing between economic control by these giant monopolies and international collaboration. And they're not distinguishing between the economics of it and the politics and activism that we need, because we need governments to be collaborating too.
I think you're pointing out a really, really important, really, really hard point to solve, which is the question of also there, the both and, right? We have not shown yet as humanity that we are actually capable of governing ourselves beyond a small group. But at the same time, we somehow must find ways to do that in a way that's actually life-serving. And as we become aware of the interdependence of all of us on this planet, we also have some recognition of the need for a global governance in which we ensure that we can actually create an equilibrium for all life to thrive. So both is true, right? And
but can I just say, sorry, I shouldn't interrupt you, because I'm mad.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead. It's all right. I'm talking much more than you, is it?
Yes, that's my dream. That's what I want. I want to learn from you.
Okay. So, the distinction is that we don't need to increase the power of government over the local. What we have to have this clear distinction between privatization upwards into a global empire of monopolies that have no rules, and their infrastructure has been laid out as a red carpet funded by our governments, bigger ports, bigger airports, bigger superhighways, bigger everything, faster everything, the connected infrastructure, the internet, the mobile phone, now AI, all tools for that empire, which also, by the way, thrives on war, social dilemma style, social media warfare between people, but also literally war. So it's a monstrous structure. So we want to increase the power of our governments over that empire, while simultaneously decreasing their power to regulate us at the local level. So the amount of stuff that's being brought in to prevent healthy farming and to prevent, George Monbiot actually goes on and more or less talks about fascists wanting raw milk and not liking fast food, dissing them. it's like, it's really, really scary, the brainwashing. And so, you know, and the fact that, you know, you have farmers in France who had been, families for 3 generations have been doing goat cheese for the local town for 3 generations. Now, EU regulations, you have to have tiles in the ceiling, among many other things, costing thousands of dollars in the name of hygiene. You know, it's so much of it is absolute rubbish, and it's destroying the potential for the healthier economic activity at the local level, and not just in farming. You know, even we knew already in the, again, I guess it was late 80s, that big hotel chains in America were lobbying the government to bring in regulations for people who had bed and breakfast. This was then not part of this global Airbnb. It was individual families who wanted to let out a room. And now they were told, because of big hotel chains, getting the government to regulate, they had to have fire mattresses, which, by the way, are toxic. They had to have fire doors, which cost thousands of dollars. And yeah, anyway.
I would love to use this as a foundation for further conversations, and where we drill deep into one specific topic. And I sense that there are many, but maybe the first one we should tackle is food systems.
Yeah, good.
Food systems from the local to the global scale. How do we actually do this properly? And really focus one conversation on this. I'd love to do that.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.